Today, we are going to go over bones and skeletal tissue. Let's jump right in. So why does this matter? Understanding bone anatomy and the process of bone remodeling allows you to work effectively with patients' bone disease such as osteoporosis. Another one could be scoliosis. Also bone cancer, very rare, but it can still happen. Cancer can attack anywhere. Usually cancer, this ends up developing some type of leukemia. So it's very important. We don't really necessarily think of skeletal tissue as an organ, but it has lots of cells, and you'll see all the cells when I talk about them. So the human skeleton initially consists of just cartilage, which is replaced by bone, except in areas requiring flexibility. So we're going to go over cartilage. What is cartilage, the different types of cartilage, and where I can find them. So again, don't forget, it's called osseous tissue. And you'll learn what these little circles and what they are and what they provide for skeletal tissue. Basic structure, types, and locations. Skeletal cartilage. We're going to go right into cartilage. Made of highly resilient mold cartilage tissue that consists primarily of water. Collagen, right? There's also collagen in the mix as well. Contains no blood vessels or nerves. The downside to that, if you damage or tear cartilage, it takes a long time to actually recover, and sometimes it doesn't even recover. So cartilage itself has this pericardium, a layer of dense connective tissue surrounding cartilage like a girdle. Okay, helps cartilage resist outward expansion, contains blood vessels for nutrient delivery to cartilage, and the exception to the rule, not all cartilage has a pericardium. Articular, hyaline cartilage, and fibrocartilage do not have pericardium, and I'll talk about what that is. So articular hyaline cartilage is just where movement takes place. So here in the knee, you have movement, so it doesn't make sense for you to have this little thin layer or coat of this type of layer of dense connective tissue. Also, load-bearing fibrocartilage. They do not have a pericardium, so make sure you make a note of that. All right, cartilage is made up of, don't forget histology, chondrocytes. So they're chondroblasts first, and then they become chondrocytes. Okay, so looking at it in this manner, so you have skin, fat, connective tissue, you have a muscle layer here, you have cartilage, and this is where your pericardium is located. It's a very, very thin layer. You sometimes find it if you're eating chicken, you grab one of those bones, and if you lightly peel on the actual, you'll sometimes see on the actual cartilage itself, you'll sometimes see like a little layer that comes off. It's about as thick as saran wrap. So again, don't forget chondrocytes, cartilage. 3 types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage, most abundant type, contains collagen fibers only. Located in a few places, articular, ribs, larynx, nose tips. Okay, so I want you to know the general function of what all 3 of these are and where can I find them. I will be testing you over that. Then we have elastic cartilage, similar to hyaline cartilage but contains elastic fibers. Only 2 major places, ear and epiglottis. Then last but not least, the load-bearing, which is fibrocartilage. Thick collagen fibers, has great tensile strength. Meniscus of knee and vertebral discs in your vertebrae. So anything that's a load bearing, that's holding all your weight, fibrocartilage. So let's move on to the next picture so we can go ahead and see an actual visual representation where I find all 3 of these cartilages. So we have hyaline cartilage in your larynx and your trachea. Nice and movable, very flexible. In your ribs, hyaline cartilage in the middle of your ribs. So you need enough flexibility, but you need the strength as well. That's the beauty. That's the beauty of cartilage itself. It takes a lot to actually be able to break these ribs, right? Especially the cartilage itself. Then we have articular cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is all in your joints. Remember the membrane that's not located there? Make a note of that. Don't forget. Nose as well is made out of hyaline cartilage. Then we move on to elastic cartilage. Only 2 major places, epiglottis and your external ears. So your ears are made out of elastic cartilage. Then we have load-bearing, fibrocartilage, knees. You have your vertebrae as well. So for this slide, I want you to know where, if I tell you what type of cartilage can you expect to be found in your meniscus or in your knees. Make sure you know, oh, fibrocartilage. What can I find in my ribs? What type of cartilage can I find there? Hyaline cartilage. So make sure you know this. So that's the takeaway from this. Make sure you know the 3 different types of cartilage and their basic, right? Most abundant, elastic fibers, thick collagen fibers. What makes them all different? They're all cartilage, but they all have their distinct features and where they're located. And I went over this in this slide. So make sure you take note what type of cartilages I can find in which location. Growth of cartilage, 2 major ways. Appositional, interstitial growth. So appositional, cartilage forming cells in the pericardium secrete matrix against external face of existing cartilage. New matrix laid down on surface of cartilage. So this is from the outside. I'm laying cells on the outside of my cartilage. Interstitial is from the inside. Cartilage cells, chondrocytes, are dividing from the inside of my cartilage. That's all that is. Chondrocytes within the lacuna divide and secrete new matrix expanding cartilage from within. So the major takeaway from this interstitial, the growth is from within. New matrix made within cartilage. Okay? So outside, I either lay cartilage in the outside or I lay cartilage in the, or cells in the inside of cartilage start to divide internally. Interstitial growth. Function of bones. Support for body and soft organs. I need support, right? Everything needs to be anchored to something. Protection, very important. Protect brain, spinal cord, and vital organs. Movement. Levers, that's where all my muscles are attached to. Mineral and growth factor storage, very important. Calcium, phosphorus, and growth factor reservoir. I store things. It's a storage mechanism as well. Blood cell formation. In AMP2, you'll find out that there's tons of cells, and I'll show you a quick picture of all the things. All your cells, stem cells, blood, platelets, all start off here in your red bone marrow. Triglycerides, used for storage. You also have a storage mechanism, another form of storage. Hormone production. Osteocalcin is secreted by bones, help regulate insulin secretion, glucose levels, and metabolism. And these are just a few major functions, right? So again, when we start really looking into skeletal tissue, we realize all the things it does for us. So again, this relates to number 5, blood cell formation. Look at all these cells. We have all my stem cells, multipotent hemopoietic stem cells or hematoblasts. They become either a myeloid or a lymphoid. It's either, look at all these cells, these are all your immune system, this is also your immune system. This is just one little snapshot of all the stuff that's produced, leaves out of your red bone marrow. So very, very important skeletal tissue. Classification of bones. So bird's eye view, I want you to know, this number I do want you to know. 206 bones in the human skeleton, divided into 2 major groups based on location, axial and appendicular. So all axial is your skull, your vertebrae. Appendicular, everything else. So 206 bones, and those are split up between the axial and the appendicular skeleton. Looking at it in this manner, you can see the breakdown. Appendicular, I always think of this as peripheral nervous system, axial, central nervous system, right? So your central nervous system all the way down your vertebrae. As I leave, I have my appendicular skeleton. So these are the 2 major groups right here. And this is how either you're axial or you're appendicular. Classifications of bones. 4 major shapes we have. We have long bones. Longer than they are wide. Limb bones, most of them. This is an example. Short bones, cube-shaped bones in wrist, ankle, sesamoid bones form within tendons. Example, patella. vary in size and number in different individuals. So long bones, short bones. Right, here's an example, metacarpals, short bones, also the patella in your knee. Then we have flat bones, thin, flat, slightly curved, sternum, scapula, ribs, most skull bones as well. So that's an example, scapula, sternum. Irregular bones, complicated shapes, vertebrae, and hip bones, right? These are, everything else is an irregular bone. Your vertebrae is the major example. Oh, sphenoid bone is another example of it. Bone structure. Bones are organs because they contain different types of tissues, right? Bones, osseous tissues predominates. So that's the actual tissue, osseous tissue predominates, but a bone also has nervous tissue, cartilage, fibrous connective tissue, muscle cells, and epithelial cells in its blood vessels, right? So bones are alive. They're constantly being broken down and rebuilt. 3 levels of structure: gross anatomy, microscopic, and chemical. So this is what we're going to discuss right in here: gross anatomy, microscopic, and chemical. So let's take a look at it. So your bone tissue, compact bone on the outside, and this is made out of a specific type of ostein that I'll talk about in a bit. So you have compact bone on the outside, and the inside you have spongy bone. Spongy bone either has red bone marrow or yellow marrow in it, depending which bones we're talking about. This stuff, the spongy bone, its official name is trabeculae. It's like a network of spider webs that helps keep your bones strong. Compact bone is the first initial line of defense, and this spongy bone also helps, gives your bones that strength, but they're also very, very light. If you've ever picked up a bone, even from a large cow, they're actually very, very light, but very, very strong. It's because it has this compact bone in the outside and this trabeculae that helps withstand that pressure from the outside. Open spaces between trabeculae are filled with red or yellow bone marrow. As you can see right in here, this is nothing but red bone marrow right in here. There's a bit of yellow marrow out here as well. So what is yellow marrow and spongy red marrow? Hemopoietic tissue and bones. Red marrow is found within trabecular cavities of spongy bone. In newborns, all the medullary or the middle medullary cavities, they're all red marrow in the beginning. As you grow, you become an adult, red marrow starts to shift and move out to the heads of femur and humerus, except in flat bones. That's all red bone marrow. So in your femur and your humerus, in the middle, you're going to have yellow marrow, and that's a storage site, right? So in your red marrow, all your cells start off right there. And this is example. I gave you another slide that showed you your different white blood cells that you have, red blood cells, platelets. So most of your cells start off here in your red bone marrow, right? Lots of stem cells that become, depending on what type of hormone or peptide is attached to a specific receptor, will become a different type of cell. Yellow marrow, its major function is to store adipocytes, where triglycerides can serve as a source for energy, the last fat to be lost due to starvation. So your body will pull this fat if it's in starvation mode, which takes a long time for it to happen. Structure of short, irregular, flat bones, they do not have ostein, which I'll talk about in a bit. It does have compact bone in the outside, and its major structural component is all this spongy bone, or trabeculae itself. Then looking at a couple of, so when we look at a long bone, we have epiphysis, the outside, the distal and the proximal, and then we have the diaphysis, the shaft, right? So the ends of each bone, this is a long bone, ends of the long bones that consist of compact bone. Cartilage covers articular joints as well. So this is just proximal and distal, right? The shaft, diaphysis, epiphysis. as well. So the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis. So proximal closer to the midline, distal further away from the midline. This is a better way of looking at it. This is just a way you can think of it. A fracture happened in the distal end of the left hand. So you know it's far, the midline cuts the human in half. So if I say something distal, it's further out. Then we have the actual bone itself. There's always layers. Everything we talk about the human, there's always some type of covering. We have the periosteum that's outside of all bones. It's a double layer membrane, white double layer membrane that covers external surfaces except joints. So remember, you don't want any membranes on joints that are constantly moving. Just a cartilage, and that is it. Then we have periosteum, right? Outer fibrous layer containing many strong collagen and fibroblast cells. The inner osteogenic layer contains many stem cells and osteoblasts. Then we have this perforating Sharpie's fibers, as you can see right in here. You pull this back, you have all these fibers. So this periosteum is a double layer membrane, an outer fibrous layer and an inner osteogenic layer, and it glues itself to your bone tissue. And this is where all my arteries and my veins connect to, and they glue themselves to. They use that as a place where they can essentially attach themselves to. That's the other function of a periosteum. And then we move to the endostinum, which is the inside. So all this is another delicate connective tissue membrane covering internal bone surfaces, lines canals, and passes through compact bone. Contains osteogenic cells that can differentiate into other bone cells depending on what stimulation they get via a polypeptide, a peptide, or some type of hormone that attaches to the receptor. So endostinum, this lines all this trabeculae. It's a very, very thin layer. That's what that is. So two layers. We have periosteum and endostinum. Periosteum on the outside, double layer membrane. The endostinum lines the inside of all my trabeculae. Cells now of bone tissue. Now pay close attention to these cells because they all sound essentially the same. They all start with the same letters. There's 5 major cell types, each of which is a specialized form of the basic cell type. We have osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, osteocytes, and bone lining cells. As you can see, the first 4 sound exactly the same, but they all do different things. Osteogenic cell, mitotically active stem cell in the periosteum and endostinum. When stimulated, they differentiate into osteoblasts or bone lining cells. So this is my stem cell. This is where I start off. Depending on what hormone or peptide is attached to the outside, I become something else. So that's my osteogenic cell or my stem cell of skeletal tissue. Osteoblasts, bone-forming cells that secrete unmineralized bone matrix called osteoid. Osteoid is made up of collagen, calcium binding proteins. As it solidifies, it becomes your bone tissue. So osteoblasts, they're the ones that are actually producing my bone matrix. Collagen makes up about 90% of bone. So remember, it has to be nice and strong, but it has to be flexible enough to withstand all the movement and all the pressure that we constantly put on our skeletal tissue. Osteoclasts. You see these little ruffled edges? Giant multinucleated cells function in bone reabsorption breakdown of bone when active cells are located in depressions called reabsorption bays. Cells have ruffled borders that serve to increase surface area for enzyme degradation of bone. So osteoclasts and osteoblasts are constantly working in conjunction. As osteoclasts come in, start removing bone, right behind them you have osteoblasts laying it back down. So your bone tissues are always constantly going through the breakdown and remodeling. Again, that's why they are so resistant when they break, because you have specified cells that build them back up and break them back down. So bone tissue is highly resilient. Then we have osteocytes, mature bone cells in the lacuna that no longer divide, maintain bone matrix, and act as stress or strain sensors. They communicate information to osteoblasts and osteoclasts, cells that destroy bone, so bone remodeling can occur. So these guys, these little guys, it almost looks like nervous tissue when you look at them in the microscope. So osteocytes, mature bone cells in the lacuna, so these little crevices that you see right in here, these are all osteocytes. Major function, communicate information to osteoblasts and osteoclasts. They're the major bone remodelers, right? Breakdown and laying of bone tissue. So this is the makeup: osteogenic cells, osteoblasts. These osteoblasts end up getting buried and then they become osteocytes. Then you have osteoclasts. These guys are the ones breaking bone back down. These are the ones when I need to release any type of minerals, I need to call upon these osteoclasts to break it down and release it into your bloodstream, right? So you can think of these as harvesters as well. Then bone lining cells, these guys kind of just hang out. Flat cells on bone surfaces help maintain matrix along with osteocytes. On external bone surface, lining cells are called peristeel cells. So these guys are just hanging out, these bone lining cells. Depending on what stimulation they get, they can become osteocytes. All right? On internal surfaces, they are called endosteel cells. Then we look at the actual compact bone. The major part of your compact bone is this osteon. This is the load bearing. This is the actual construction, how your compact bone is so strong. So as you can see, it's a bunch of these little circles of compact bone. You put those all together, and that's what gives compact bone its lightness but its strength at the same time. And then in the middle, as you can see, it has its blood supply, or the Harvesian system. So the major strength of compact bone is your osteon. That is what gives bone tissue its strength. You put all these together, tightly packed together, and it gives bone its lightness, but also how strong bones are. Perfectly engineered. So this is one osteon. An osteon is the structural unit of compact bone, acts as a tiny weight-bearing pillar. Structures in the central canal. There's, as you can see, the Harvesian system. You have arteries, you have veins, and you have nerve fibers. Again, how do I bring things in, right? Because remember, I have all my cells. I need oxygen. I need to bring in nutrients or whatever I need to bring. Then veins, I need to pump everything out, all my waste. I need to go and retrieve more oxygen. And then last, I have my nervous tissue. That's my electrical system. That's how I'm able to feel things out, send in action potentials as I need. Then you have this laminate. As you notice, it's a pillar, but it's a pillar made out of a lot of rings put together. As you can see how it's set up. And you make it in multiple layers, so several rings of bone matrix. This is how compact bone is laid together. In between, you have these thin amounts of collagen fibers run in different directions. So by laying these ring structures in different patterns in a column, that's how you withstand stress. So again, bone or compact bone itself it's literally an engineering marvel, the way it's able to withstand pressure from every angle, and it also has enough flexibility to actually withstand stretch and pull. And what that is the collagen fibers that run in the middle of this. You lay down little ring structures in every single angle, and then you create a column. And that is why bone tissue is very, very light, but very, very strong. Okay. Then you have, I put a bunch of osteons in here. You have the central canal or the Harvesian canal. All right, osteon, a bunch of those together, and then you have these little 90-degree turns, Volkmann's canal. All these are is to connect the whole bone tissue together. That's all that is. This little 90-degree turn that you see is called a Volkmann's canal, obviously named after the person that discovered them. Right? Connect blood vessels and nerves to the perosteum, medullary cavity, and central canal. So as you can see, this little guy, this little setup, osteocytes right in between. All in between, right? So the lacuna is where I house all my osteocytes. Small cavities that contain osteocytes, lacuna, and then the caniculi, these little hair-like cells that you see right here, connects all of them together. So they're in constant communication with each other. The osteoclast and osteoblast. Remember, they communicate with them, the ones that break down or reabsorb bone tissue and lay down bone tissue as well. Allow communication between all osteocytes of osteon and permit nutrients and waste to be relayed from one cell to another. So this is this caniculi, this is their little communication network. The lacuna is the little space where I house my osteocytes. Then the outside of compact bone, circumferential lamellae. So again, compact bone, more bone tissue in the outside. And then I have a bunch of osteons in the middle, creating that structural, that load-bearing compact bone. These layers, lamellae, extend around the entire surface of the diaphysis. Okay, help long bones to resist twisting. And then the rest, right in here, all the other space that you see in between, right in here, all these osteons, interstitial lamellae. Lamellae that are not part of the osteon. Some fill gaps between forming osteons, others are remnants of osteons cut by bone remodeling. So this is just, you can think of interstitial lamellae as just like the rest of it. What else? Not in the outside, circumferential, and this is interstitial laminae, all the rest of it. So these are the spaces in between all these osteons themselves. Spongy bone. What helps it give its strength? So all it is compact bone in the outside. The structural component of all these flat bones is trabeculae. This is the one that gives it its strength. So trabeculae and a bit of compact bone in the outside. On these flat bones, for example, this skull that you see here, there's no osteons are present, but trabeculae do contain irregularly arranged lamellae and osteocytes interconnected by caniculi. So this is its structural support, the trabeculae. Acts like cables on the suspension bridge, confer strength to the bone. So your skull is very, very strong. This setup that it has, your skull is about as thick as your thumb, but it's very, very strong. Again, it houses one of the most important, if not the most important organs, your brain. Okay? Bone is made up of both organic and inorganic components. I gave you the organic components just right now. Right? Bone lining cells, osteocytes, osteoblasts, osteogenic cells, and osteoclasts. Inorganic components. All I want you to know is what they are. Hydroxyapatites, or mineral salts, make up 65% of bone by mass. Consists mainly of tiny calcium phosphate crystals in and around collagen fibers, responsible for hardness and resistance to compression. Last long after death because of mineral composition, can reveal information about ancient people. So, when a body is found, like in this case, that's what you're testing for. Okay? They will solidify, so you'll still see these inorganic components. Although organic components are already broken down and they're being reabsorbed by other organisms. But these hydroxyapatites, mineral salts, they're the ones that stay around for a long time that you see right in here. It's an archaeological dig. And this is what they're going to test to be able to test for how long these have been there, right? So then now we go on to the basic cracks and breaks and fractures that happen with bones. They're classified in a few different ways. During youth, most fractures result from trauma. Okay? In old age, most result from weakness of bone due to bone thinning. Or in this case, this person kicks this individual at the perfect angle and he breaks his bone, right? And that is not good, right? Or you're playing around again, even though bone is very, very strong, skeletal tissue, you put the right pressure at the right angle and it will break. So your fractures are classified depending on a few things, right? Fracture classification: position of bone ends after fracture, completeness of break, whether skin is penetrated. So these are just basic classifications. Okay? Can also be described by location of fracture, external appearance, and nature of break. So looking at the first one, commuted. So as you can see, bone fragments into 3 or more pieces is a commuted piece. This twisting, where does this happen? Most likely in your legs. As you can see right in here, particularly common in the age whose bones are more brittle. Not necessarily, again, you can step into a hole, you twist, your body falls, and you can get one of these fractures, a commuted break. Compression, bone is completely crushed. This vertebrae, in order to produce this is a really, one of the ways this can happen is you get thrown out of your car and you land on your head. That's one way you can actually compress or break an actual vertebrae and crush it in this manner. Common in porous bones. Again, you have to produce a lot of force to essentially crush a vertebrae, something like this. Then we have spiral. Again, ragged break occurs with excess twisting forces are applied to a bone, common in sports fractures. Like that guy, that was more than likely a spiral. When those guys that were playing arm wrestling, as you can see, that cracked up. So this crack, usually the fracture happens and it runs up the actual skeletal tissue. Then we have epiphyseal. So you have this epiphyseal plate. This usually tends to occur where cartilage cells are dying and calcification matrix is occurring. Epiphysis, right, separates from the diaphysis along the epiphyseal plate. So this is where growth happens. This will happen to a lot of teenagers because they're in the process of growing. So this is an epiphyseal break. So this, as you can see, it cracked, it broke off. That is where growth is happening. That's how you get taller. This is where cartilage is, and this is where your bone is actually lengthening, and that's how you end up growing, right? So this usually happens in teenage years. Once you reach your designated height, this calcifies and becomes bone tissue. So this shouldn't happen when you're an adult. Then we have depressed. Broken bone portion is peered inward, typical of a skull fracture. This will happen in a skull more than likely, a depression that happens. This, again, in order to actually crush this in, lots of force has to happen. Okay? In this case, someone took a bat to this person and actually was able to depress the actual skull. Then you have green stick. This is very common in hands and in feet. Sometimes you have this in a long bone like this. So this fracture actually takes the most to actually detect, and it also takes a long time to actually heal. Because these are so minute and so painful, but they're constantly, what you're doing is you're constantly breaking them and opening them up over and over and over again. So these tend to be these hurt a lot if you have this one, right? And even with this x-ray, as you can see right here, it's really hard to actually pinpoint them. But this person will experience very excruciating pain constantly with these green stick fractures. Treatment involves reduction, the realignment of broken bone ends. A closed reduction, physician manipulates the correct position. There's an open reduction, surgical pins or wires secure ends. Immobilization, this is the one we're used to, right? You get a hand, your arm is casted, right? So first you got to realign it. So the physician will realign and make sure the bones line up. You don't want them to misalign, and then now your bone will grow back, and you have like these weird lumps, and you can't move those. Especially something like a skull. I mean, sorry, especially something like the mouth, where you need constant movement there. Or pins. You're gonna put pins in here when you pretty much shattered this thing, right? There's multiple pieces in here, right? You didn't have a clean break. Multiple breaks happen, so I have to put pins to essentially keep everything in place while your bone starts to regenerate. And then the one we're used to, right? Immobilization in a cast, or this right in here. This is the most common one that you have. Most of the time, bones will, when they break, they do a clean break, and you can easily just put a cast over them, and they're fine, and it takes a few weeks, and you're good to go. So that is the last part. So make sure you know the different types of fractures that I just talked about. Make sure you know the different cells. Make sure you know what's the difference between compact bone and trabeculae. Okay, very important. Make sure you know the basic bones as well as I just talked about. The cells, trabeculae. Make sure you know cartilage is very important as well. Don't forget cartilage, where I can find the different types of cartilage. I talk about it in this manner. So you can't talk about skeletal tissue without talking about cartilage. So again, I will leave you today. You guys have a great day. See you next time.